With your permission, High Commissioner, can we begin?
You know, I'm in your hands. You're the concert master.
Thank you, High Commissioner. And I think, yes, Bhavna, over to you. We can begin now. And we are already live streaming this panel discussion on our YouTube channel at the Indian Futures. Over to you, Bhavna.
Yeah. Am I audible, Manish?
Yes, please go ahead.
Namaskar and good morning to all joining us from India, and very warm greetings, especially to our friends from Australia, Japan, and the US. I'm Bhavna Dabhare, President of the Indian Futures. I take this opportunity to welcome you all today on behalf of the Indian Futures. I cannot but begin by hoping you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Let me at the outset introduce the Indian Futures very briefly. We are a New Delhi-based independent and idea startup that started out in January 2016 with the sole aim to creating a global platform to plainly and dispassionately discuss in the truest ancient Indian tradition of a samvad, a dialogue, the ideas of New Delhi, New India in all their varied dimensions and contestations. The simple idea is to go beyond the headlines of the day and have an honest, deep dive conversation amongst the thinking community in India and abroad. The idea is to organize and probe our minds on a contemporary theme of critical relevance to India and the world. We are extremely proud to have recently hosted some of India's finest minds from the world of government, politics, academia, diplomacy, and culture. Shri Suresh Prabhuji, former cabinet minister, Shri Devendra Fadnavis, former CM of Maharashtra, Shri V. Muralidharan ji, Dr. Vidya Sahasrabudhe, President of ICCR, Ambassador Raghavan, Chairman of NSPC, Ambassador Nirupam Menon Rao, and Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, recently retired Foreign Secretaries of India, Ambassador Gautam Bambavle, former Indian Ambassador to China, Professor C. Rajamohan, Professor Makarand Paranjpe, Director IIS Shimla, Yamini Iyer, CPR President, and Rajiv Sadasai are just a few I have named here. Before I hand over to Manish, I introduce the theme of the workshop. I would like to request you to follow us on all social media such as FB, Twitter, Insta, and YouTube, and feel free to share today's event with hashtag TIF Pod. We would welcome that for sure. Kindly put yourself in silent mode too to avoid any distractions in the program. Thanks again to one and all who have joined us here and on YouTube, where we are already live streaming the event. Over to you, Manish, now. We'll introduce the theme of our international workshop.
Thank you, Bhavna. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Let me all welcome you again for this very special session, Australia session of our workshop on Quad and the Indo-Pacific. We are truly privileged to have an assemblage of really top minds, and obviously topping them all, High Commissioner Barry Farrell, who is the Australian High Commissioner to India, and Ambassador Wadhwa, who I can see has joined us, Professor Amitabh Mattu, and Dr. David Brewster, who would be joining in another 15 minutes or so. To set the ball rolling in a way, I just wish to flag some issues, I think, which each of the speakers, the very distinguished speakers, would be really sharing and reflecting on. And I think in that sense, Indo-Pacific now, which is really the theme of the workshop, is so central to Australia's strategic imagination. Obviously, it starts with this whole shared notion, a shared vision of a free and an open Indo-Pacific, and very much deeply embedded in understanding of a rules-based international order. And again, here I think coming to Australia specifically, the Indian Ocean interests are really driving Australian interest, Australian stake in the Indo-Pacific. And again, the Indian Ocean interests have also featured very prominently in Australia's strategic discourses in recent years. For example, you can really talk about protecting Australia's exclusive economic zone, search and rescue operations in the broader Indo-Pacific region, obviously protecting critical sea lanes of communication. What one can also discern looking at Australia's foreign policy in recent years is really a long-term commitment to the Indo-Pacific. And in fact, that is best exemplified by the $2 billion Pacific pivot on infrastructure, which was announced in 2018. Coming to India, Australia, and where really how Australia looks at India, and I think here India has really emerged as a linchpin of sorts in its larger Indo-Pacific strategy. And Australia, it seems, is now putting all its energies to realize the really untapped potential of India's rise in many ways. In fact, we all would have noticed Australia's government support to India Economic Strategy report, India Economic Strategy 2035 report, which was really a roadmap of sorts for continued Australian investment and engagement at a very deep level, purely again embedded in economic synergies to bring India and Australia together. And in fact, we have with us Ambassador Anil Vadva, who in fact authored a report the other way around. The Australia Economic Strategy Report, which was released December last year by the Commerce Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal. And what we are, but the larger concern, which I'm sure again the panelists would really talk about, is the big elephant in the room, China. How Australia is actually looking at China? Is it going to, and again, to what extent does it have a differentiated approach from other Quad countries? At some level, you see that Australia has been much more vocal, much more vociferous in articulating its concerns about China, be it about demanding an international impartial inquiry into the origins of COVID virus, which we are all battling, and also seeing immediately the responses, banning beef exports from Australia, raising tariffs on barley. I think that is very much a cause of concern, not just to Australia, but to countries in the Quad and also in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm pretty sure and very confident that we are going to have very excellent presentations from each of the speakers who have joined the session today. Let me now turn to introducing our speakers, our panel, and we are extremely delighted, and it's really a rare privilege and honor to have High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell with us, who is the Australian High Commissioner to India and Ambassador to Bhutan too. His Excellency Farrell was the 43rd Premier of New South Wales and Minister for Western Sydney from 2011 to 14. He was the leader of the New South Wales Liberal Party from 2007 to 2014, and was the member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly from 1995 to 2015. So he really brings political heft, political weight to the table when he is the High Commissioner of Australia in India. We are very grateful, sir, that you could really find time out and join us today. Thank you so much again. We also have with us, and I'm truly privileged to have Ambassador Anil Vadva with us, who is a very distinguished, who had a very distinguished career in the Foreign Service from July 79 to May 2017. In fact, in his 37-year career, he has been ambassador very significantly to Italy, Thailand, Oman, Poland, and has served in Hong Kong, Beijing, and permanent mission of India in Geneva. As Secretary East, and again very important assignment, a very significant assignment in the MEA. He oversaw relations with ASEAN, Southeast Asia largely, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. Thank you so much, Ambassador Vadva, for joining us. It's again an honor for us that you could really take time out and be with us today. Professor Amitabh Mattu, who is my senior colleague in the department, in the program which I also am in. He is currently the Professor of Disarmament Studies at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, SISJNU. He was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Jammu from November 2002 to December 2008. In fact, the youngest person to serve in that position. He concurrently served as a member of the National Knowledge Commission, a high-level advisory group to the Prime Minister of India. He has also been a member of the India's National Security Council's Advisory Board, and also a member of the task force constituted by the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh on global strategic developments. Recognizing his contribution to education and public life, the President of India honored Professor Mattu on the occasion of Republic Day 2008 with the Padma Shri, one of India's highest civilian awards. Thank you, Professor Mattu, for joining us. You continue to inspire all your colleagues, all your senior and junior colleagues and students with your generosity, with your continued and very high-level scholarly engagement. Thank you so much. We also will be joining by, as I said, Dr. David Brewster in the next couple of minutes. He is a senior research fellow with the National Security College, Australian National University, where he works on Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific maritime security issues. He also holds appointments as fellow with the Royal Australian Navy Sea Power Centre and distinguished research fellow with the Australia India Institute, University of Melbourne. Dr. Brewster's books include India as an Asia-Pacific power, which is about a seminal book of sorts about India's strategic role in the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean. And India's Ocean is another book, the story of India's bid for regional leadership, which examines India's strategic ambitions in the Indian Ocean. My apologies, I just also skipped a very important assignment of Professor Mattu, where he was the director of the Australian India Institute, and in many ways came with many path-breaking ideas on taking the India-Australia relationship to much greater heights, which we are seeing today. So thank you all for really making this panel much more exciting, much more interesting, and really setting the bar high for joining us today. Thank you, and with this, I now invite High Commissioner Farrell to deliver his keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Well, I should start by saying namaskar and g'day. And thank you for that kind introduction, Manish. It's a pleasure to be able to speak as part of the Indian Futures Quad and the Indo-Pacific Virtual Conference. I acknowledge my distinguished fellow panelists, Anil Vadva, Amita Mattu, and of course, Dr. David Brewster. You've asked me to speak and focus on the Indo-Pacific Australia relations and the Quad, and that's what I intend to do. This gathering is a timely opportunity for me in the backdrop of what's been a challenging period for India. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacted a terrible toll, both in terms of lost lives and livelihoods deeply affected. I extend my sympathies to all those who've been touched by India's devastating current wave and pay my respects to those who've passed away in recent weeks. And sadly, this includes some very good friends and contacts of the Australian High Commission here in Delhi. But Australia stands with India at this difficult time, and that's what, of course, our friends do. Just as India gave so much to support COVID-19 responses across our region and around the world, Australia has moved quickly to provide support to our friends in India, including oxygen concentrators, ventilators, and the offer of further medical supply. This is an initial commitment by the Australian government, and we stand ready to provide more assistance if and as required. It's this trend of friends sticking together that I think is the underappreciated story of the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, and Australia-India relations today. In recent years, we've seen the Indo-Pacific emerge as the world's most consequential region. It's becoming the world's strategic centre of gravity. It's home to the world's most dynamic economies and projected to account for 2/3 of the world's future economic growth. By 2030, it'll be home to a middle class of 3.5 billion people. And by any measure, we live in a region on the rise and one that's coming closer together. Alongside the tragedy and impact of COVID-19, the pandemic brought countries and people together. The most obvious are the vaccines being rolled out worldwide, the result of astonishingly fast and fantastic work by our researchers and scientists collaborating across borders to address a common challenge. It's evident in the support given by countries, including Australia and India, to our neighbourhood and partners all over the world. I've marvelled at how quickly the Indian government deployed medical teams, medicines and equipment across the Indo-Pacific and further afield across Africa, the Caribbean and Latin America. But COVID-19's downside extends beyond the death, dislocation and despair which has accompanied its progress and spread across nations. It's accelerated many of the concerning trends we already faced in the Indo-Pacific and indeed globally. Great power rivalry, particularly between the US and China, has been on the rise. In recent years, China has more openly challenged established international rules and norms in a way that concerns many states, including Australia. And these are rules and norms that would have served the interests of all countries, whether large or small. Tensions over sovereignty have been rising, whether on the line of actual control in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. Nationalism, disruption and new geopolitical realities have seen global supply chains fragment and shift. The use of grey zone tactics and disinformation has been increasing. The deployment of new threats like cyber attacks and foreign interference is growing in frequency and in sophistication. And all this means we face significant hurdles at a time when our resources and our attention are spread over multiple domains. And that makes coordination towards common goals more important than ever before. As Prime Minister Morrison said this week, Australia is using all of its agency as a country and a government to pursue peace for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Our overriding objective is ensuring that Australia's national interests are always advanced. And one way to do this is through building our partnerships across the Indo-Pacific, including, of course, with India. Through our collaboration and coordination in responding to shared regional challenges that I've outlined, there's been a tectonic shift in the Australia-India relationship over the past year or so. Australia and India call the Indo-Pacific home and share a responsibility to safeguard the Indian Ocean. We're also both dialogue partners of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and we share a commitment to building an open, inclusive and resilient region with ASEAN at its centre. Our defence relationships strengthened significantly in recent years, and last year we again joined with India, Japan and the United States in Exercise Malabar. During the pandemic, our leaders, ministers and senior officials, along with counterparts across the region, have been in regular contact as they share insights and information on tackling COVID and other common challenges. And of course, in June of last year, our two Prime Ministers met via virtual summit, where our bilateral relationship was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Agreements covering a range of areas from education and research collaboration to water and critical minerals to defence and maritime cooperation were signed. At the summit, both Prime Ministers also committed to working together through the pandemic and beyond to shape the Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Modi called this, quote, our sacred duty, and Australia couldn't agree more. Australia wants to work with India as the natural leader in the Indian Ocean region to help ensure our shared neighbourhood is healthy and peaceful. It's in the interests of all the Indo-Pacific nations that the region is underpinned by respect for sovereignty and rules and norms that foster stability and prosperity. This includes rules-based trade, which spurs the economic growth which underpins our living standards. It also encompasses regional architecture. Australia and India will pursue this agenda across the key regional architecture, including the Indian Ocean Rim Association, ASEAN-led forums such as the East Asia Summit, and global forums such as the G20. Australia is pleased to be the lead partner with India on the marine ecology pillar of the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, and we'll work together to protect our fragile marine environment to support the interests of communities across the region. We also cooperate with a number of countries through a range of groupings to share in the direction of the Indo-Pacific. Australia and India have consolidated separate trilateral consultative mechanisms with Japan, Indonesia, and France, through which we're developing coordinated approaches on issues vital to the region, including supply chains, the blue economy, and multilateral institutions. Japan and Indonesia, as vibrant Indo-Pacific democracies, and France as a key regional player, are vital partners to Australia and India's efforts to build regional architecture and cooperation in support of our shared Indo-Pacific interests. The Quad is an important grouping of 4 like-minded democracies committed to supporting the principles they believe in. It's an important forum for dialogue and for us to collectively respond swiftly to the most pressing challenges confronting the region. The Quad's origins, of course, date back to our cooperation in the wake of the December 2004 tsunami, which created an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in the Indo-Pacific. And similarly, the Quad's momentum has picked up over the past year as we've confronted the global health issue of COVID-19 with an uptick in the other regional challenges. The Quad's positive and practical agenda shows our regional partners that they have our strong support. It complements our respective bilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation, including with ASEAN, to promote an open and inclusive and resilient region of sovereign and independent states. The Quad leaders meeting on the 13th of March was indeed historic. It sent a strong message of our commitment to act in support of the region, anchored in international law. The leaders agreed to a landmark vaccines partnership, work to combat climate change, and coordination on technology standards. These initiatives are good examples of the practical ways that the Quad is delivering for our region. The vaccine partnership plays to the respective strengths of our 4 countries to expand safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing and delivery in close cooperation with the WHO, COVAX, and the ASEAN Secretariat. Australia has committed $100 million to the initiative, in addition to our broader $500 million program supporting regional vaccine issues and health security, and $80 million support for COVAX, Advanced Market Commitment Facility. Australia's funding will be focused on supporting last mile vaccine delivery across Southeast Asia. Now, the Leaders Summit builds on the extensive work by the Quad foreign ministers who've met 3 times in the past 2 years. Over this time, our 4 countries have deepened practical cooperation on the core challenges facing the region, ranging from maritime security to quality infrastructure, counter-terrorism, humanitarianism and disaster relief, cyber, and countering disinformation. COVID-19 has indeed been a testing time for the Indo-Pacific and the world. Not only has the health and economic crisis brought by the pandemic tested us, but we've also seen an acceleration in other challenges, including threats to territorial integrity and sovereignty. Yet in spite of this, we've also seen a number of countries step up, working together to build a positive future for the Indo-Pacific and a wider world. COVID-19 has shown in testing times that vibrant and open democracies, like India and Australia, who eschew right is might policies, can make a positive difference on the Indo-Pacific and help build an open, inclusive, and resilient region. I look forward to participating in question time. Thank you, Manish.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this brilliant, very insightful keynote address. You raised and flagged out many issues, what sort of engagement Australia, what sort of vision Australia has about Indo-Pacific, and also very importantly, obviously, about India's role in it. Obviously, you started out by really identifying very correctly that Indo-Pacific, the region now has gained a salience, not only because of the geopolitical contestation which we are seeing in some ways, but also the economic power, the economic potential which the region has. I think that has assumed larger salience, and that exactly brings many countries to the region in many ways. You beautifully again pointed out how India-Australia relations have widened, have deepened, and again that has happened very rapidly in the last couple of years. Obviously, the high mark in many ways was the first virtual summit which India had with Australia once the COVID hit us all last year. So I think that is a very important, in fact, a very important way of communicating to each other how deeply we value each other. You also talked rightly about many multilateral forums, the ASEAN East Asia Summit, IOR ARC, where India and Australia are actively collaborating, are actively exchanging notes, also WHO. And coming finally to this notion of Quad, how Australia sees the Quad, and you really pointed out a very important point that ultimately it is really about a shared vision of the Indo-Pacific, and again how the shared democratic values which India and Australia carry are really the bedrock of more positive direction, more positive trajectory in which the relations would be moving. And the COVID era, I mean, the COVID times we are living in, the COVID world, I think you very gave a very fair assessment how that has in fact increased some problems on the security front, rather than concentrating on mitigating this very important threat to human security. Some nations are indulging in acts of aggression in different ways. uh, Obviously, we all really appreciate, even in the emergency, it's a health emergency which we can see in India, Australia coming forward and really helping India in whatever very significant ways possible. So on behalf of the countrymen, I think we should be thanking Australia for this large-heartedness. So thank you, High Commissioner, again for this very brilliant keynote address, and I'm sure this has given food for thought for many of us, including the very distinguished panelists we have with us today. So thank you again. With this, I now request Ambassador Anil Wadhwa to address us. In fact, as I was mentioning earlier, he was the author of a very important report on Australia economic strategy. So I think we would like to hear more on that from you, Ambassador Wadhwa. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manish. Um, as you mentioned to me, I'm going to actually focus not so much on the Australia Economic Strategy report today, but on a different topic, which is very important for the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, and that is about creating alternatives for infrastructure development, as well as resilient supply chains, which they've discussed on many occasions in the past, quite recently in the summit, which was held in March. So that will be the topic that I'll talk to today. And of course, I'm ready to answer any questions on the report if the audience so desires. So let me begin by going back to the Belt and Road initiatives, because if you remember, it was in 2013 when Xi Jinping actually unveiled his vision of the Silk Road economic belt in Kazakhstan and then the Maritime Silk Road in Indonesia. And these were the proposals that resulted in the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative that eventually boiled down a lot to infrastructure development was important, but its geostrategic ramifications have been felt quite widely, in particular in the Indo-Pacific. Now, not all in the region have embraced the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese belt, which is seen by many as opaque, stoking concerns about high levels of debt in some countries, and also the Chinese control leading on to acquisition of strategic infrastructure like ports and airports, and is also seen by many as a fig leaf sometimes for military expansionism. But countries and governments in the region and beyond have struggled to offer an appealing and competing alternative. So the way forward to meet the challenge of growing Chinese influence and threat perceived by others in the Indo-Pacific and beyond has obviously received attention from those who've been adversely affected. In fact, if you recall also, the United States embraced the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which was floated by Japan in order to counter the growing geostrategic dominance by China. And from the US point of view, the national security strategy under Trump clearly mentioned that China seeks to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. It seeks to expand the reaches of a state-driven economic model and also to reorder the region in its favor. So the US obviously saw China's militarization of artificial and other disputed islands in the South China Sea as an attempt to restrict the free movement of trade, which undermines regional stability. And then Japan came up with an alternative quality infrastructure plan and initially set aside $200 billion for infrastructure in the Belt and Road related countries. We had the launch of the Indo-Pacific Infrastructure Trilateral Forum. That had happened, if you recall, in 2018 to make the private sector engage with Australia, Japan, and the US at the governmental level for investments in connectivity and infrastructure projects in the region. We also had a Build Act, which was then passed for the US Congress in the same year to meet the challenge of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad countries have also looked at working together on infrastructure projects as an alternative to the Chinese BRI by pooling their resources. So this would, of course, include funding made available by various countries at and lending institutions in different stages for the region. Let's take, for example, the Japanese FDI in ASEAN, the ADB's leading Asia's private sector infrastructure fund is called LEAP. That was created with JICA. And then we have the $60 billion funding through the Build Act and the $1.5 billion appropriation per year up to 5 years through the Area Act of the United States. There's been also an infrastructure initiative by Australia, which we should not forget. That's worth 2 billion Australian dollars, which is aimed at the Pacific. India provides $200,000 each year on a rollover basis to each of the 14 island states who are members of the FIPIC. That's the Forum for India-Pacific Island Cooperation for Development Projects. And this, of course, is in addition to the ASEAN India Fund, the ASEAN India Green Fund, and the 1 billion credit facility announced for digital and infrastructure connectivity by India, which happened way back in 2015. So all these resources can be pooled for a few model projects, in my view, as capability demonstrators. India can also consider joining others in specific infrastructure projects which have an impact. Japan and India, for example, have always expressed the hope of working together in infrastructure-related projects in the Indo-Pacific, and have indeed worked on at least 3 projects which are in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, and in Myanmar. Now, in this background, the Blue Dot Network, which was built as a multi-stakeholder initiative by the private sector, the civil society, and governments, was also announced, if you recall, by the United States, Japan, and Australia. And that happened in November 2019, if I recall correctly, at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum in Thailand. And then the 3 partners conveyed that they plan to certify infrastructure projects, including ports, roads, and bridges around the world, with a focus on the Indo-Pacific, which meet high standards of safety, transparency, accountability, sustainability, and developmental impact. So that the stated purpose, of course, was for private investors, the US pension funds and insurance companies, which manage long-term assets to get the confidence to address the global need for infrastructure, which was then estimated at around $94 trillion over the next 2 decades. And closer to home, the ADB expects that infrastructure needs of the Indo-Pacific alone could be worth $1.7 trillion a year through 2030. The idea is very promising, but faces a lot of questions still about the system to be followed by certification and also funding incentives for recipient countries to shell out more funds and wait longer for the much needed and often very urgent infrastructure. these questions will need satisfactory answers if this initiative is to succeed. Um, the Blue Dot Network announcement also followed the establishment of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation in 2018. That was a replacement, if you recall, of the U.S. Overseas Private Investment Corporation as the lead financial institution in the United States. So the DFC and its Japanese and Australian counterparts then led the initiative, with the DFC in possession of twice the financial muscle of the earlier OPIC, and can now invest up to $60 billion. It can also take equity positions in investments as opposed to just lending. And it has a mission to support US foreign policy objectives like its Japanese and Australian counterparts, which is the Japan Board for International Cooperation and the Development Finance arm of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So we also have discussions which are on with the EU and others for cooperating in the framework of the Blue Dot Initiative. The G20 has endorsed a set of principles for quality infrastructure investment. This happened at their meeting in Osaka in 2019. So a wide array of countries may join this initiative. The infrastructure projects, of course, will need to follow the G7 Charleroi commitment on innovative financing for development. There's also the Equator Principles, which task financial institutions to assets and manage environmental and social risks in power projects. So basically, it builds on the success of Japan's G20 lead in building a consensus on the principles for quality infrastructure investment, which is the basis for the vision of the Blue Dot Network. So what happens now is that the US aims to bring innovative companies and technical expertise, the rule of law, to combine with pensions and insurance funds wanting some returns. And the governments of the three countries, unlike China, of course, cannot fund the infrastructure needs, but they can mitigate the environmental, the health, the social, safety, inflation, and foreign exchange related risks by taking some equity and also lending support to these projects, which would leverage private capital. So it is essentially, in my view, a confidence building exercise. India, of course, has not joined this initiative as yet, but of particular interest to India is the fact that under the Blue Dot Network, infrastructure projects within the Indian Ocean region will be certified in keeping with globally recognized standards, which are then based on transparency and financial viability. So, of course, the initiative will need a lot of work for two main reasons. First, it will not provide direct financing and therefore may not be what developing countries need. And secondly, the Blue Dot Network will require coordination amongst multiple stakeholders when it comes to grading projects. So I think the way forward here is to standardize implementation of large and some symbolic projects with transparent and clean finance, and to carry out effective project delivery. And the private capital, of course, we all know cannot match the Chinese state capital. And the emphasis on high infrastructure standards will not deter Southeast Asian countries if China continues to disburse faster and risk averse and more responsive funds. The Blue Dot network projects would be able to raise debt, including from abroad at affordable rates. So that's an attraction. And all in all, the partners in the Blue Dot network need to increase the pool of projects which carry adequate funding and provide technical help to the Indo-Pacific countries to manage the Belt and Road Initiative projects. For example, through the multilateral development banks, which could be seen as politically neutral and technical arbiters. Now, even as the Blue Dot network was being considered as an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the pandemic came along, and that brought about an unprecedented halt in the manufacturing operations across countries. This also resulted, if you recall, in a supply disruption that was beyond the preparedness that countries had in place for the usual contingencies. And over the past few decades, China and a few other countries have, as we all know, emerged as manufacturing hubs. in the Indo-Pacific. Multiple factors have contributed to this. Of course, economies of scale, lower labor costs, access to technology, governmental support to industry, etc. All these have drove this trend in China. This also led to development of new sea routes for trade and consequently favorable sea freights and in turn further concentration of manufacturing. So with the onset of the pandemic, the economic benefits of this strategy started to be compared with the supply chain risks and consequent risk of a complete shutdown in operations that emerged from this approach. And then we saw that diversification emerged as an important and a necessary measure. To begin with, there were trade tensions, if you recall, between the United States and China, which preceded the pandemic, and that got exacerbated in 2020. That has accelerated the breakup also of the world's technology supply chains. And the US companies were forced to limit their China ambitions due to geopolitical realities. So a new system of regional rather than global supply chains now appears increasingly likely. And countries like India, which have a large supply of cost-effective labor and technical talent, obviously want to use this opportunity to galvanize their own manufacturing and also work with other like-minded countries in the region to reduce the China dependency factor. So last year, the Japanese government, if you recall, had set aside $2.3 billion for the shift of critical industries from China to Japan, out of which 10% was set aside for a shift to the Southeast Asian countries, India and Bangladesh. And this proposed shift, except for a few companies in the electronic sector, it was countries like Vietnam, Taiwan, and Thailand. They have been the preferred destinations for most of the shifts. Obviously, India will need to create necessary conditions if it wants to cash in on the China plus one strategy, which most of the entrenched companies of China have been adopting. So with this agenda of resilient supply chains on their minds, we also had the meeting of the trade ministers of India, Japan, and Australia. That video conference was held on the 1st of September 2020, where they reaffirmed their determination to take a lead in delivering a free and fair and inclusive, a transparent, predictable, and stable trade and investment environment in keeping their markets open to each other. So other countries in the region were also called upon to participate in the initiative, and the role of business, academia in this initiative has been recognized. Most importantly, they decided to support the need for some specific activities for enhancing the resilience of the supply chains, which include those related to promotion and facilitating trade and investment, and also diversification of the production base. Basically, these ministers, when they met, they identified the need for digitization of trade procedures and also adopting electronic documents commensurate with the capacity. Not everybody has the same capacity, but it's an important step for facilitating trade and therefore maintaining resilience in the supply chains. What was also discussed at that meeting was the need for looking at countries with similar a line of thinking in terms of being reliable and dependable suppliers for ensuring resiliency in the supply chains of the region. Finally, we had the initiative being launched formally at another virtual meeting that happened just a few days ago on 27th April, when the three ministers again decided to initiate some policy measures to remove the vulnerabilities that they have in the supply chains by matching each other's requirements through suppliers in their countries. In addition to exploring the possibility of diversification, of course, India has offered to initially support the supply of 5 products in the partner countries. What it boils down to is that the Supply Chains Resilience Initiative will focus on sharing best practices on resilience and also holding some investment promotion events and buyer-seller marketing events to provide the opportunity for stakeholders to explore the possibility of diversification in their supply chains. Now, once in a year meeting at the ministerial level is of course not enough, but there will have to be therefore meeting of the officials much more frequently. And our own minister Piyush Goyal has again invited the Australian and Japanese companies to set up their manufacturing base in India and also to integrate India into their supply chains. Um, there is already an existing Japanese industrial township initiative in India, and that focuses on sectors like auto, FMCG, on electronics, solar power plants, and chemicals. This can become a base for this trilateral initiative. Japan has also sorry, Japan has also looked at the initiative with ASEAN countries. And obviously, when this happens, this kind of an initiative happens, the all the countries have to look at how they can reorient their market policies. They have to look at how their growth potential can come into play. They have to look at countries with a similar geopolitical strategy to work with if this initiative is to succeed. Now, this can easily be replicated by the Quad countries because they've also discussed this at the meeting on 6th of October in Tokyo first, and again have reiterated this at the recent summit meeting. I think both India and Australia have taken a lot of internal reforms and initiatives to make sure that their own manufacturing is boosted. In India, we've had the PLI and the PMP schemes which have been rolled out. 13 sectors have been identified, as you know, for the PLI schemes. The Trilateral Supply Chains Resilient Initiative and the Quad one, which is then expected to follow, especially for the vaccine manufacturing from India and then distribution in the Indo-Pacific, will obviously require the participants to agree on some amount of preferential investment rules. Tariffs will have to be looked at. Quality standards will have to be looked at. Rules of origin will have to be determined for value addition. And there will have to be some agreement on cross-border data flows and dispute settlement mechanisms. But there is a shortage of time. So what the participants will need to do is to utilize what they have as existing agreements between their countries, and as they go along to put in place further measures for trade facilitation and work with the other like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific as much as they can. Finally, I think there will have to be a better, regulatory framework within the countries as they adopt, to working together for resilient supply chains. And I think some country-specific steps are also necessary if the initiative is to succeed. India, for example, needs to simplify its labor laws to improve its infrastructure and also improve its digital economy. Japan needs enhanced productivity. Australia needs to mitigate the effects of high wages. And the United States, when it comes along in the Quad context, will also need to improve and protect its technological progress. So sum up, it is the enabling environment in the partner countries which aim to improve their supply chains resilience in a cooperative manner, which needs now real focus and improvement. Let me end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Wadhwa. I think it was a very comprehensive state of play on infrastructure development and supply chains. I think you rightly started out that unless and until we understand where this is coming from, we really cannot, fathom the level of what sort of challenges are coming our way. In that sense, OBOR is really the fountainhead of all the responses which we see specifically in the domain of infrastructure development and supply chains. And in fact, in many ways, that is the real meat of what is happening in the Indo-Pacific theater. multiple initiatives at the bilateral level, at the domestic level, and also the multilateral level. Obviously, very importantly, the Blue Dot Network, which you pointed out. I think you really made a very valid point, and I think many would agree that ultimately states are going to look at regional solutions rather than focusing on the larger global supply chains. I think that is the focus now, which you rightly flagged. Obviously, on the India Australia, since that is the panel here today, you really also pointed out very rightly that, in fact, both states internally have also taken up internal domestic reforms in the economic and business domains. But you also flagged that ultimately it is important and very important that you have better regulatory networks, frameworks for especially in on the issue of resilient supply chains. And again, for example, India, you talked about the labor laws which have been done. Australia also has to address the concerns about high wages. So I think that was really a very a broad sweep, and really gave us a much clear, much richer understanding about how India and Australia, or how Indo-Pacific largely is seeing these questions, which in fact have originated from the OBOR of China, which has, as you rightly pointed out, has a very serious, not just geopolitical, but even economic ramifications, implications for the entire region. So thank you, Ambassador Wadhwa, for that brilliant address. With this, I now invite Professor Amitabh Mattu to address us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Manish, and thank you, Indian Futures, for inviting me for this extremely important conference being held at a critical time for both our countries and indeed the world. I want to acknowledge the presence of His Excellency Barry O'Farrell, the High Commissioner of Australia in India and the former Premier of New South Wales, Secretary Anil Wadhwa, and Dr. David Brewster, my old friend and colleague and collaborator. Delighted to see you, David, even if virtually. May I also echo the sentiments of my previous two speakers and say that we are meeting at this time when there is the pandemic has taken a heavy toll on human lives. And this morning itself, a great legal luminary, a great jazz aficionado, Soli Sarabji, passed away. So let me acknowledge his passing away and pay my deepest condolences on all our behalfs to the family of Mr. Sorabji. Manish, you asked me to speak on the India-Australia partnership. And this is what the session is today about. And there is no relationship really which is closer to me, both in terms of my head and in terms of my heart. And there are very few countries in this region where there is a similarity of values, interests, where there's such a congruence of values, interests as India and Australia do. Yesterday, figuratively speaking, we used to speak about curry, Commonwealth, and cricket. Today, Barry O'Farrell talks about diaspora, democracy, defense, and dosti. Tomorrow, I say that both the 3 C's and the 3 D's will lead to the 4 E's, and that's my IPR on that, which is on energy, economy, education, environment, and epidemics. 5 E's actually. So 5 E's, 3 C's, 4 D's, and 5 E's. And these 5 E's, which is the epidemics, energy, economy, education, and environment, are going to define our relationship, of course, with 1 C, which has been spoken about, which is the elephant in the room, which is China. Let me, as an academic, put this in both a historical perspective as well as flesh it out a little more. How many English-speaking, multicultural, federal democracies that believe in and respect the rule of law are there like Australia and India? Of course, occasionally you have overzealous diplomats trying to control the freedom of the press in both countries. Um, but apart from these overzealous diplomats, and due apologies to our distinguished diplomats here, there is a deep commitment in both countries in the robustness of our democracies, in the argumentative traditions of our two respective democracies. And apart from those values that democracy brings, that liberalism brings, that English speaking brings, we have this strategic interest in ensuring a free, open, inclusive, and rules based Indo Pacific region. And that's the peg on which you have organized this conference. A region in which principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and international law are ensured and respected. We have, in addition, in terms of the diaspora, Indians being probably the single largest largest source of skilled migrants in Australia. And if the economic relationship as imagined by Anil Vadava's report and Peter Verghese' earlier report is translated into reality, this relationship the world is really the oyster for this relationship. Let me also say this, that in New Delhi, and let me speak for New Delhi here, there's a near consensus within the political leadership. And when I spoke to the foreign minister a few months ago, I had gone to speak about Jammu and Kashmir, but we only spoke about Australia and the importance of Australia. And so there is a near consensus within the political leadership here and the strategic community that the Australia-India relationship is not only an idea whose time has well and truly come, but this relationship has to be fostered. I would say that the External Affairs Minister probably has the strongest relationship with his counterpart in Canberra, the Foreign Minister Marisa Payne. And whether it's water management or trauma research, to skills, to higher education, from maritime to cybersecurity to counterterrorism, there is a world of opportunities which awaits us and which we are already taking advantage of. Let me also say this. A few years ago, the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne, housed by the University of Melbourne, and the Sydney-based Lowy Institute commissioned one of the most comprehensive surveys of Indian public opinion on key foreign policy issues and critical challenges of governance. Even then, which is about a few years ago, 4 years ago, Indians ranked Australia on the top of 4 nations towards which they felt most warmly. Only the United States, Japan, and Singapore ranked more highly. 4 years ago, Indians felt warmer towards Australia than towards countries in Europe, including the United Kingdom, and much more so than Indians felt about the BRICS countries. In many ways, the 7 decades characterized by misperception, lack of trust, neglect, missed opportunities, and even hostility. Even Schadenfreude, we used to take great pleasure in the suffering of each one of our countries. That chapter is ended. Today, India and Australia have developed a new thesis, a new book, a new chapter in their bilateral relationships. In fact, when this is a function of the last decade, and coincidentally, serendipitously, this has in some ways also reflected in my personal journey with Australia. A little over a decade ago, Manish will remember when I decided to be the founding director of the Australia-India Institute, it was seen by my colleagues and by my family as a giant leap of faith. I had not visited Australia, had little knowledge of the countries. My friends said I was literally going down under, soon to become irrelevant and marginal to all policies issues. At school, at high school, my teenage daughters were told they risked being bashed up in school and college, and my extended family was astounded. But today, let me say that it was one of the best decisions of my life, with not one unpleasant experience in the country. As a family, we have found Australians open, friendly, fair, accepting, and generous, and the country a model of good governance. So therefore, I think we need to now work together, and this pandemic, as the bushfires before them demonstrated, that even in the worst of times, we can still find huge opportunities to work together. Let me remind you that about a couple of years ago, the wildfires ravaged much of the eastern part of the country and burnt 12 million hectares of land in Australia, destroying native flora, killing thousands of wild animals, including endangered species, and displacing residents and tourists. And Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, said Australia is confronted with a dystopian vision where apocalypse becomes the new normal. You could say that about India today. But as much as Australia has overcome that dystopian vision of what the wildfires presented, I hope India can work with Australia to overcome this dystopia that we are witnessing today. But that's not all, because within these 5 E's lies a world of opportunity, particularly in terms of education. And that's an area which I have been flagging all the time, that digital platforms today and the quality of both higher education and vocational education in Australia today is something that we can learn from. And given India's low-cost, high-volume model, it's easy to transfer that knowledge from Australia at a relatively low cost. So I was speaking yesterday to the Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, Alan Myers, and I talked to him about how the University of Melbourne, for instance, can, at least at this point, even digitally, be a convener of experts on public health issues, be a collaborator in terms of genome sequencing and all the other vaccine development issues that are before us, and be a communicator of what best practices are possible to be able to destroy this pandemic, or to at least suppress this pandemic, as Australia has done. But in terms of climate change issues, and it's in terms of the environmental issues, as I said, there is a huge body of knowledge that exists and common challenges which face the two countries. You know, in 1965, and Barry, if I have your attention for a moment, in 1965, Arthur Tang, High Commissioner to India, and one of Australia's most formidable diplomats, wrote to his foreign minister, Paul Hasluck, that there was fertile ground between the two countries, but no one seems to know what seeds to plant. More than 55 years later, in the midst of the pandemic, I'm sure His Excellency Barry O'Farrell knows exactly what seeds to plant. In fact, probably has so many seeds to plant within the fertile relationship or the climate that exists between the two countries. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mattu. I think this was really a brilliant address, and that's exactly why we keep on learning from you again and again. Thank you so much. I think again a very brilliant point, which many would easily acknowledge now, maybe not earlier, that there is so much congruence of values and interest between India and Australia that really is pushing this relationship in a very vigorous, faster way, in a very positive direction. And again, three C's, four C's, D's. But I think very important. I mean, they are very important. Elements of congruence. But the five E's which you pointed out: energy, economics, environment, epidemics. Obviously, since we're battling it in a very serious way now, and education. I think these five E's really set the tone for a diplomatic dialogue, for diplomatic engage, an intense diplomatic engagement in days and in weeks and months ahead. Obviously, China is really the elephant in the room, which we all need to address head on. Again, very important, some very important positives which you talked about, which seem to be taking this relationship forward, is obviously in the arena of Indo-Pacific, is the shared vision of Indo-Pacific. I think that's very important point which you raised. Obviously, how diaspora is really the key is emerging as the key force that binds India and Australia much more tighter. And again, you rightly pointed out that how there is now an increasing bipartisan consensus on the positive trajectory of the India-Australia ties. We have really overcome our historical hesitations with Australia, and I think this really bodes well. And in fact, I'm sitting in JNU, sitting in Delhi. We have seen Professor Amitabh Mattu going to Australia, and how actually his own personal journey captures this closing, this coming together of India-Australia ties, not just in personal ways, but really as people-to-people contacts are now deepening. I think that that's a very good sign for the future. So thank you again, Professor Mattu, for this brilliant address. I now invite Dr. David Buster, who has joined us for this panel. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. Buster.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I should start out by saying that all of us here in Australia are really watching events in India with a great deal of concern and sadness, and I want to convey that our thoughts truly are with you, and we hope that this storm will pass and we can all get back to our normal lives. So it's with a bit of trepidation that I follow Ambassador Wadhwa and Amitabh Mattu, who both have given very erudite talks. I'm going to be probably a little bit more simple, so bear with me. I'm just going to give an Australian perspective on the Quad, and really from a 10,000 foot view, asking ourselves to stand back and think about what the Quad is, where it fits with the region, and how it might develop in the future in terms of the possibilities. So I'll ask a handful of questions and give my own views of what the answers are. I don't pretend to give the correct answer, but at least they're questions and that we can be thinking about. And the first question for me is, where does the Quad fit in the Indo-Pacific? How does it fit within all of the other regional structures? And to my mind, the Quad is really the backbone, or in the future years will become the backbone of the Indo-Pacific as part of a complex web of regional arrangements. It includes four of the four big maritime democracies in the region who share a lot of values and other attributes. And around them spins these other webs of arrangements. And these include bilateral arrangements such as, or relationships that each of us hold with other countries. And I'll just give an example of the India-Vietnam relationship, which is really quite important in helping to anchor the region together, and a series of other growing trilateral relationships. Some examples are India, France, Australia trilateral, which is growing in importance in the Indian Ocean, and the India, Indonesia, Australia trilateral. And there's also a number of multilateral groupings, which some of them we need to work together to increase their effectiveness, but nevertheless, they're very important. Now, I'm not talking about this as complexity for complexity's sake, but it's really a recognition that the Indo-Pacific is a very large and very diverse region with a diverse range of strategic perspectives and traditions and histories. And this can't all be stitched together in a single grouping. It's simply too diverse, too big for that. And so we need to understand that our region will, in coming years, be this whole web of different relationships. And as for the four Quad partners, I think really have to be thinking about how we can each play to our strengths in these relationships. So I mentioned before India's long-standing relationship with Vietnam, which is an element of some significance in the South China Sea, and also its growing relationship with Philippines. On the other hand, Australia and some of the other Quad partners, such as Japan, are developing relationships with India's South Asian neighbours, really as important and complementary relationships to India's leading role in the region. And so as we go forward, we need to think about how we can develop further webs of relationships to really complement each other's strengths. That's my sort of point on that one. My second question is, well, what security issues or other strategic issues should the Quad be concerned with? And the starting point for this is obviously China. It's China's, I think without doubt, the issue, the shared concern that has brought us all together. We just can't avoid acknowledging that. But that's not to say that we don't share a whole lot of other, have a lot of shared concerns about a whole lot of other issues, whether they be political instability, economic instability, violent extremism, or climate change. And we have to understand these other issues not only in themselves. Of course, we have shared environmental concerns about climate security, but also about their overall impact on stability in the Indian Ocean region and the consequences of not addressing them. If we do not address, say, the instability being experienced in Myanmar, we can be certain that other countries will step into that vacuum and use that instability for their own advantage. So we've got a whole lot of reasons to be addressing a whole lot of different sorts of threats across our region. And those sort of concerns are going to grow, whether it be insurgency in Mozambique, whether it be climate change impacts being felt right across small island states. We need to work together to help manage these threats. As I mentioned, if we don't, then someone else will. So what are the key areas for cooperation among the Quad partners? Obviously, the Quad initially started out very much with a defence focus, very much with a naval focus, and that's expanding into other defence areas. And I'd say that we need to be thinking more about how we can work together, not just in the maritime space, but in other military spaces as well, including Air Force cooperation. But just really in the last, I suppose, couple of years, the number of areas of cooperation between Quad countries has proliferated, whether it be infrastructure, as Ambassador Wadward was talking about, whether it be economic coercion, supply chains, critical minerals, cyber, and COVID. And I'm sure there are many other areas where we must and should cooperate in the future that we haven't yet really fully understood. But at the same time, we must have to be careful not being overwhelmed by the number of different areas of cooperation. We need to be focused in actually implementing cooperative activities rather than just having these proliferate around us. And we need to, given the number of areas of cooperation, we also have to start thinking about what structures or procedures we need to put in place to properly manage and coordinate this multifaceted cooperation, rather than every issue area just running off by itself. Okay, so the next question for myself is, should we look at the Quad as an alliance, an alignment, or a coalition? And I don't have any absolute answer to this. It's an evolving creature, and that's part of its strength. We shouldn't, I think, rush in to label things in one way or another. And to a significant extent, the way the Quad evolves is going to be a function of China's actions in the region, its level of assertiveness. We saw last year its actions in Ladakh really caused a sea change in a lot of Indian public opinion and pushed the Quad into, I suppose, new areas of cooperation. At the same time, I think the other Quad members are very sensitive and aware of India's traditions, strategic traditions in terms of sensitivities about alignments and alliances, etc. And I think the other Quad countries are fully aware of that and willing to cooperate and work with India as India evolves in its own thinking as well, just as the other Quad countries thinking are evolving. But overall, I think certainly at the moment, the informality of the Quad arrangements are a source of strength in terms of allowing different countries to follow different concerns and strategic traditions to some extent. Although I do think that there is room for greater planning, and we have to think about how that planning can take place while retaining the benefits of informality. So that leads really to the question of institutionalization. How and to what extent should we try and institutionalize these relationships between them? There's value in informality, as I mentioned, but there can also be value in structures. At the moment, we're seeing really a broadening area and proliferation of areas and points of contact, whether it be between foreign ministers or defence ministers or trade ministers, and across a multitude of other agencies between them. And as I mentioned, we have to be, while each of those contacts and discussions and arrangements have no doubt are warranted, we need to think about how they can be coordinated. We should, I think, overall try as much as possible to avoid formality and formal institutions. But I do think that there is potential for us to be talking about developing an informal secretariat of some type to at least manage and help coordinate the agenda. I don't know. I can't really say more than that. But I do think that we need to be at least thinking about how to how to coordinate this big agenda we have while keeping the benefits of informality. The next question I have is broadening versus deepening. And this is a sort of a perennial question with any important and successful grouping. To what extent should we be focusing on broadening the relationship between the existing partners, or deepening the relationship between existing partners, or broadening it to include other like-minded partners within our region, for example, France, for example, South Korea, and then a number of other countries that that we could think about. And look, similar questions are being asked about in the Five Eyes community as well. To what extent should it be broadened to include other partners? I acknowledge that there can be room for a lot of different opinions about this, but certainly my strong feeling is that we need to be focusing very much on deepening our relationships between us, building even more trust. We've come a long way, but building even more trust before we think about what other partners to include in any arrangement, if that's the way we want to go. But it's not as if we're sort of cutting off other partners. And I mentioned, for example, the India, France, Australia trilateral, which is a very important and valuable mechanism for bringing cooperating with France, a key partner in our region. And I think a great deal can be achieved in these other webs of relationships without necessarily broadening the membership of the Quad as yet. Also, a key point in thinking about any partners, it's absolutely important that any partners we think about bringing into our the Quad must have the ability and the willingness to contribute to broader Indo-Pacific security. We must not become a debating club with a myriad of members who are not willing to and capable to contribute to security right across the big Indo-Pacific. So that's a fairly high bar that I would set for Quad membership. Finally, I just wanted to make some comments about democracy. How do we balance the value of democracy and the use of democracy in rhetoric versus the reality that we face in our region of a diverse range of governance arrangements among important countries in our regions? And it's always a very difficult balance to achieve, particularly when I think it's fair to say that democracy is a core value among all of the four Quad partners. But in my view, we have to be careful of not allowing this shared value of democracy to exclude other important partners in our region, or make it the absolute guiding reason or approach of how we engage with some countries, because the reality is there is a diversity of governance arrangements right across our region. And so I would suggest that in thinking about how we talk about what partnerships we can build across our region, we should be focusing on principles, perhaps, rather necessarily than values. Principles of rules-based order and compliance with the law, rather than necessarily values, because I think that's really, in terms of addressing our shared concerns about China, it's what we really need to be focusing on is what do we share with other important partners in the region as in terms of how the way we want the world to operate. And to me, it's about principles of the rules-based international order is something that we should be emphasising more than our shared democratic values. So with those words, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Manish.
Thank you, Dr. Brewster. I think you really gave a very, again, like the previous speakers, a very comprehensive, a very insightful take on how Quad is being seen. And again, I think one very serious and very significant point which you flagged, which you point out for all of us, is that we need to get the Indo-Pacific right first, that it is a very, very large, a very, very diverse region, obviously, and with many diverse histories and diverse perspectives. So we really need to take that on board before we reach any definitive conclusions on how Quad seems to be going ahead in the Indo-Pacific theater. Again, for the paucity of time, I would just like to mention that you really brilliantly pointed out what sort of security issues, what sort of concerns are there. Obviously, China, and again, the nature of Quad itself, whether it's an alliance, whether it's an alignment, or can we call it just a coalition of the willing. I think that's a very important issue, and also the question of institutionalization. How do we take it from here? I think those are very valid concerns which you raised. So thank you again, Dr. Brewster, for really joining us today and for this very insightful address. With this, we open up to questions, and I have received a number of questions. Rather than asking, since we are almost reaching the end of the session, so let me just point out. Let me just pose a number of questions, and any of you and each one of you can easily respond to it. I've just collated questions, and one of the things which has come out in many questions is the people-to-people linkages. To what extent are they still the weak link, maybe not the missing link, but obviously the weak link, and how, for example, the Indian High Commission in Australia and the Australian High Commission in India, how are they really trying to really spruce up this, a very sort of important challenge for both countries? That's number one question. The number two also coming out largely, and there are many questions for Ambassador Wadhwa, but again, talking about the economic sort of partnership. I mean, to what extent are India and Australia much more closer in dealing with the so-called China problem in the economic domain? I think that is one, if I can summarize the question in that sort of thing. And for Professor, and especially on, I think where Professor Amitabh Mattu can really chip in is what sort of academic linkages are possible and need to be strengthened. Obviously, you talked about the public health issue now, but using his perch of being in Australia for years now, so what sort of challenges does he specifically see in developing much more linkages? Yeah, over to you. Maybe we can start with the Australian High Commissioner. So please unmute. Yeah.
Thanks, Manish. In terms of people-to-people links, I think that's been going well. Certainly, can I say that this High Commission and the High Commission in Canberra have a close relationship. We will miss Gitesh Sarma, who's just retired, but Manpreet Vora is there. I've met him before he went over. We'll maintain that relationship. But, 1 in 30 Australians are of Indian origin. More than 700,000 people born in India in Australia. And that, I think, has already shaped our country. I know when I first came here in 2010, it was at the urging of an Australian of Indian origin who, as I was facing a state election the next year, said, you'll need to discover this country because it may be economically important to New South Wales. So I think business opportunities are being identified. Clearly, there's a strong education link between our two countries, and I commend Amato for raising that again. But I think the people-to-people links are helping us on both sides. But if I had a wish, it would be to see more businessmen and women to businessmen and women links. It's at that trade and economic area that I think we need to do most work.
Great. Professor Mattu?
Manish, I think the High Commissioner has already pointed out that there's been this huge growth in people-to-people relationship. And while about a decade ago you didn't have enough champions, I think you now have a critical mass of champions who want better relations and who are working towards better relations. Clearly, there is still a missing link in terms of B2B, business to business, more collaboration. I think Australian businesses have traditionally found it difficult to do business in India, but hopefully that will change. India requires, as you and I know, a certain amount of patience to be able to get the return on investment. So it's something that I think there's a learning curve, and Australians are learning how to do business in India. There are Indian business people who are, of course, invested in Australia heavily. But in terms of the educational linkages, let me say there's a world of opportunities. First of all, let me begin with some of the projects which the two governments are facilitating. There is the Scientific Research Fund, which gives substantial grants to collaborative research on the grand challenges facing our world and our bilateral and our two countries. Then the Australian High Commission has already announced grants for work on maritime issues of the Indo-Pacific. I think they had grants also for cybersecurity issues, which are for companies and think tanks in India to apply for, obviously following the FCRA and other regulations. But in terms of universities, I certainly think the Australian universities, there are 39 universities, and except for a couple of other universities, these are all primarily publicly funded universities. Of course, they raise a lot of income through research and consultancies and tuition fees. But in Victoria and in New South Wales alone, you have about 6 universities which are among the top 100 in the world. And they provide a safe, secure, quality education. Clearly, post-pandemic, I hope that Australia will become a natural destination for Indian students rather than Oxbridge or the Ivy Leagues, particularly for the reasons that I have just highlighted. But there are lots and lots of other opportunities by which universities in India and Australia can collaborate. And now that the UGC itself, the University Grants Commission in India, has allowed for top 100 universities, or which are listed among the top 100 universities in the Times Index or the Shanghai Jiaotong Index, to set up innovative collaborations with universities in India, I think that's something, again, Australian universities can take advantage of. As I said, there is absolutely a huge wealth of opportunities. And one area of opportunity where most people think that they haven't found the right model, which is vocational education. After all, Australia is a leader in vocational education. And in India, you lack skills. Only about 10% of your skilled or your carpenters, plumbers, electricians have actually gone to a training school. So it's all unorganized sector. To provide state-of-the-art skills, there is a room for collaboration. However, the Australian model usually works on a high-cost, low-volume model. Now, if we can transform that digitally through a hybrid system or a digital system into a huge, high-volume, low-cost system, you could easily use TAFEs and vocational education centers in Australia to further skills education in India. You're going to need, as Devi Shetty said yesterday, of the founder of Narayana set of hospitals, the biggest need tomorrow. Today it was oxygen, ventilators, hospital beds. Tomorrow it will be doctors, nurses, paramedics. We need at least 50 million paramedics to handle the number of patients who will be contracting this infection. Now, I know anecdotally that there are initiatives in Australia which are trying to train paramedics virtually or through a hybrid model. I think we need to do that with a sense of great emergency, great sense of urgency, because that's a need that we cannot ignore given the circumstances that obtain today. Thank you.
Brilliant, sir. Can we now have Ambassador Wadhwa?
Yes, Manish, I think, first of all, to add to the previous two speakers and to their answers, I think there's a good infrastructure which exists for people-to-people contacts in both countries. There is Australia-India Youth Dialogue, which is doing very good work. There are organizations like the IABCA, whose background you can see on my screen because I just spoke for them, so it's still on. Who are doing some very good work in promoting the people-to-people linkages. And of course, the two high commissions are doing extremely well in that field as well. I think the future of our relationship, besides education and skills, with Amitabh quite well pointed out, I think we also have to look at how we can progress in innovation and in high tech, because that's where our needs are complementary. In my Australia-India Economic Strategy report, in fact, I've suggested that we must set up an innovation fund, a startup fund actually, with a modest amount of money to be put in by both sides, and also to augment the scientific research fund so that we can have some more emphasis, not just on STEM, but also on the humanities side, so that we have people who are trained in fields that are in short supply in India in particular. And then, of course, if you look at there was this question that you mentioned about how we can reduce dependency on China, etc. Well, there are a host of opportunities. We have now these two reports, one of course, which I did for CIA, and that is a complementary report to Ambassador Peter Verghese' report, which came out earlier as far as India is concerned. And in our report, there are at least 20 sectors that have been pointed out with concrete opportunities for both sides. I think the opportunities are there, but we have to translate them into practical cooperation through taking steps which are necessary. Unfortunately, we've had the pandemic situation which has come in between. But once this is over, I suppose the businesses should look at each other much more closely, collaborate much better, and the big businesses need to be interested in each other's countries. It's only then that we can actually increase our trade and investments, and I believe the investments will actually drive trade.
Thank you, Ambassador. The last word from Dr. David Brewster. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Manish. Okay. I'll just make a sort of a global point that COVID has caused a massive economic shake-up for both of our countries and across the world, and we really should see it as a great opportunity to recut our relationship. Certainly, Australian universities have seen a massive shake-up in their revenue models and the way they do business, and the reality is there's no going back to the old model. It just it no longer works, and they're going to have to look at new models of the way they work. And I think that there's a very good chance that India is going to play a major role in their future to both countries' benefit.
Thank you. We have now, in fact, overshot our time. Before I hand over to Shubhranshu for the formal vote of thanks, let me acknowledge the presence of Professor Shantishri Pandit, who is the head of the Department of Political Science, University of Pune, and Ms. Nirupama Subramaniam, who is a senior journalist, foreign affairs journalist and editor based in Mumbai. Thank you so much for taking time out and joining us. With this, I now request Shubhranshu from the team Indian Futures to present a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Shubhranshu.
Good afternoon, everyone. At the onset, I pray to the Almighty that everyone listening to this conversation is safe and healthy. On behalf of the Indian Futures, I, Shubhranshu Pratim Sharma, extend my heartfelt gratitude to His Excellency Barry Roberto Farrell, AO, Professor Amitabh Mattu, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, and Dr. David Bruster for their extremely thought-provoking, categorical, and enlightening presentations. I'd also like to take this moment to thank the esteemed participants and guests of this international workshop for their engagement and enthusiasm. We hope to see you all again at our concluding United States panel at 6:30 p.m. in the evening, featuring Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Deputy Assistant to the United States President Lisa Curtis, and Executive Director of ORF America, Dr. Dhruva Jaishankar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Truly an honor to have you all with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.